Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the final installment in the Reviewed and Ranked series for the Curse of the Vampire DLC characters. The previous characters we have looked at in this DLC pack are very interesting and unique, and today's character is no different. And the character actually even has a feature-length film coming out at the start of this next year, assuming it doesn't get pushed back again. That, of course, is Morbius. And I think that this is my favorite character to play out of the characters included in the Curse of the Vampire DLC. And by the end of today's video, I hope that you can understand a bit more as to why that is. But as we jump into the breakdown for Morbius, make sure to check and see if you are subscribed to the channel. If you're not, go ahead and fix that for me, and I would greatly appreciate that. And if you find today's video helpful, interesting, and or enjoyable, make sure that you drop a like as well. So we're going to start where we always do by looking at the team build synergies for Morbius. And he has 6 of them evenly split across 3 different categories. He has 2 Mastery synergies with Midnight Suns and Marvel Knights. He has 2 Vitality synergies with Gods and Demons and Ultimate Alliance 3. And he has 2 Resilience synergies with Back in Black and Big Brains. Now, in terms of synergies, they're not the greatest or most strongest synergies that we have seen, but as you are well aware, I place a lot of value in the Mastery synergies because they increase the efficiency of your synergy attacks, and that's at the very least something that's really good to see for padding out the team build that you are going with. Moving on to talk a little bit about the character's base functionality, we start with the basic attack combo. This combo has 4 different inputs that result in 5 different hits, all of which are a varying degree of different claw slashes. And they do make physical contact with the opponent, so that discourages any of the retaliation from the smaller grunt type characters, and the medium length of that combo tends to be quite beneficial, especially when it comes to building back up your energy points, which is really needed for Morbius in particular because of the abilities that he has and just how strong they can be. But we'll talk about those all in due time. Morbius's heavy attack involves him taking a long stride forward and then an uppercutting slash that raises him up into the air, and if the opponents are smaller, it will deal a lot of knockback to them as well. So there's quite a bit of power in that, and it also allows him to help close the gap with that strike as well. We'll talk a little bit more about the falling aerial here in just a moment, but do know at this point in time that you can very easily chain a falling aerial out of the heavy attack, which in my opinion really helps with the character's versatility on the battlefield. Morbius does have a flight mechanic, which is activated by pressing the jump button again while the character is in the air, and then you can move about freely throughout the terrain and navigate the hazardous floor or other puzzles that are present on the traversable area of the battlefield. But with every other flight ability in the game, there is the caveat of this ability consuming some of your energy points. So use this sparingly outside of combat because you don't get really any movement speed boost while flying. What you do get is minimal at best, and if you abuse it, you will not have the ability to use as many ability and synergy attacks off the start of your next combat sequence once you make it to that point. Morbius's falling aerial attack is a downward falling claw slash, which hits out in front of the character, but like I said, this can be chain comboed off of the heavy attack, which means that you automatically have increased damage, and realistically you should always be using a falling aerial out of a heavy attack because of the extra damage that you can apply, as well as regaining points to the energy point gauge for those ability and synergy attacks. I really like it when characters are designed this way because it allows them to be more useful than a lot of other characters in the cast. And Morbius's block and dodge animation is similar to what we've seen in the past, where he has a 2-arm brace out in front of him. However, he has his hands turned outward towards the opponent to kind of catch and claw back into them. Most of these cross blocks that we see involve the character crossing in front of them with the fists kind of balled up and palms facing backwards. and as he dodges out of the way, it is just a forward dash rather than a roll, which does kind of fit in with Morbius's feral nature. I prefer to see rolls where possible, but where this works as an animation and fits in with Morbius's characteristics, I'm not too beat up about it in this instance. It's now time for us to talk a little bit more about the abilities, and the first ability which we need to discuss is the claws and fangs. This ability is very powerful because it will cause Morbius to lunge forward at his opponents, and as he does so, he can grab onto a smaller grunt type character and continue to barrel through the opponents until he has reached the maximum distance, dealing damage to those opponents on the way through. And if he does manage to land on a smaller grunt type character, he will drain their health and temporarily boost his own damage for the duration of about 13.5 seconds, as well as heal himself for 7% of his health. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you chain this ability over and over again back onto these grunt type opponents, you can heal up a significant amount of health in a relatively short amount of time. The biggest drawback with this ability is when you do land on a smaller grunt type character, there is a very lengthy animation that needs to play out as he rips into the opponent and then draws that health. He does kind of a taunt before he becomes actionable again. So that is a trade-off that you have, but with the healing that you get out of that move, as well as the damage boost that it applies after the animation is carried out, it is quite powerful. However, I don't think that it is quite deserving of the DLC privilege move, though it is certainly very powerful and it is a hefty candidate for that award. Another interesting thing to note about the Claws and Fangs ability is, though the bulk of the damage comes from the dash, that final strength sap does have that energy blast around him, so he will deal excess damage to the characters around him or characters that seek to close in on Morbius's position, in addition to the damage that's being dealt to the trapped opponent. This ability has dual attack types with both piercing and energy, has the charge synergy trait, and boasts some nice stats, having a C classification to damage and energy points consumed, while being the go-to ability for stagger damage, having an A classification of the damage dealt to the stagger gauge. And that's particularly useful if you are able to pile drive through multiple different opponents, which in most cases you are very capable of doing. With most of Morbius's abilities, they benefit from the same rank up abilities. We will highlight the one that does not work that way, but for all of the other abilities in his kit, they will benefit from the energy point cost reduction, the increase to the attack damage, the increase to the damage dealt to the stagger gauge, and finally the reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Morbius's second ability is the Vicious Vamp. This is a high damage dealing attack that looks very similar to a lot of attacks that we have seen throughout this cast, and really anything that has that barrage synergy trait really fits in with this. The biggest attacks that come to mind are the ones that we saw in the likes of Drax and Wolverine. Now, this ability has the piercing attack type and the barrage synergy trait, and deals a fair amount of damage outright, having that A classification, though it does suffer a little bit in the realm of stagger damage dealt, and maintains a fairly nice classification of C to the energy points consumed. And despite having some very interesting particle effects from the claw slashes that go out as he's carrying out the ability, it's nothing to really write home about. Morbius's third ability is the Hypnotic Gaze. Now, this ability does not deal damage to the opponents. It is not designed for that. But what it does accomplish is very powerful indeed. Morbius will briefly charge up a powerful stare that will paralyze the opponents out in front of him. And you will notice when that has happened, because these smaller grunt type characters will have a pink foggy halo that surrounds their head, and they'll kind of go limp, though maintaining a standing position. This will render those grunt type characters immobile for just over 3.5 seconds. And not only does it leave them immobile, but it also reduces their defense. And even though it won't stun, The stronger characters such as Mighty and mini-boss type characters, they will still have the defense reduction applied to them. So this is very powerful, and because it has the ability to stun and render the grunt characters completely vulnerable, I do believe that this edges out the Claws and Fangs in being the DLC privilege move. And it really just opens up a lot of possibilities for retaliation from Morbius himself, as well as the remainder of the team. If you disagree, be sure to let me know in the comments down below, but I think that the combination of reducing the defense and rendering the grunt-type characters completely vulnerable for a short period of time is a lot more powerful than the lengthy animation that's carried out through the Claws and Fangs ability, despite the damage boost that comes from using the aforementioned ability. There's no attack type, this attack cannot be synergized, and while it doesn't deal any damage or stagger damage, it does provide more opportunity to take advantage of those characteristics in your follow-up attacks, abilities, and combos, and it maintains a very nice classification of C to the energy points consumed when using this ability. And this is the one that performs differently, so the rank up bonuses differ slightly. This ability possessing a reduced energy point cost when ranked up, as well as increased effectiveness, increased duration, and a reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. All things considered, it functions very similarly to Daredevil's radar sense, with the added benefit of stunning the grunt enemies that are captured up by the move, with the trade-off being directly out in front of Morbius instead of in 360 degrees around the character. But I think that that is a worthwhile trade. Morbius's fourth ability is the Slashing Strike, and this is similar to other abilities that we've seen throughout the cast. I mainly think of Thanos' ultimate power and Nightcrawler's Swashbuckler, where they will teleport or rapidly dash around the battlefield to close in on opponents and deal large amounts of damage to them. Now, because of that characteristic of this attack, it unfortunately cannot be synergized, but it's really good for cleaning up fights, especially when the characters are spread out throughout the battlefield. This ability has the piercing attack type, and the stats that it boasts includes a classification of C to the damage dealt, C to the energy points consumed, and a lackluster E to the staggered damage dealt, which, as painful as it is that this ability does not deal more damage to the staggered gauge, it is understandable because being able to zoom in on opponents is a very powerful attribute in its own right. So you've got to balance it out somehow, and that is a reasonable way to do so. Morbius's extreme attack is interesting in how it's carried out, but it does offer the character some really nice benefits. It involves a vortex type attack that emanates from wherever Morbius is located when he initiates the attack, and over the course of just over 5 seconds, he will attack into opponents in that radius and then draw life force from them to power up the efficiency of his following attacks at the end of the animation. And this has a fairly similar duration to the damage buff that is applied from the Claws and Fangs, again lasting about that 13.5 seconds. And that timing is based off of when Morbius becomes actionable after executing his extreme attack. However, you can really cycle this almost constantly throughout the fight between using the extreme attack as well as the Claws and Fangs ability, provided that you have standard grunt type enemies to use that ability on. There really shouldn't be a whole lot of an excuse as to why Morbius doesn't have that damage buff throughout the rounds of combat you're going on, with the exception of the rounds of combat that are against the mini-boss type characters with no other enemies present. So now that we have discussed how Morbius works as a character, we now need to determine where he fits in on our ranking of characters. And it's very clear that with the abilities and the damage buff that he's able to apply to himself in a couple of different ways throughout combat, that he is very high above the lower end of this tier list. So it really comes into consideration where he fits in or belongs up here. And I do believe that Morbius is the best character in terms of application of the 4 characters included in the Curse of the Vampire DLC. Every other character we've looked at up until this point is placed in B tier, But again, Morbius outclasses them in phenomenal fashion, which means he needs to go above Blade and on his way up into A tier. And I even feel that he outclasses a lot of the characters within this realm as well. And I think that Thor still holds a slight edge over Morbius because of the elemental type attacks that he's able to unleash and the electricity being able to stun a little bit more reliably and on a wider cast of characters. But Morbius is a very close second to being the king of A tier. So I'm going to move these characters around pretty significantly, and I'm going to have to extend this down a little bit further in order to accommodate that. But just kind of so you can visualize it, Morbius will end up right here in between Thor and Captain Marvel, and it will look a lot more presentable by the time I pull this graphic up next week as we cover Iceman. But what do you think? Do you feel like I have undersold Morbius? Do you think that I've oversold him? Do you feel like there's anything with his kit that I've missed? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are. If you've made it this far into the video, make sure that you leave that like, and don't forget to check and make sure that you are subscribed for that daily variety content. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.